Is it really that good?
I'm Foulmouth. F you, motherfucker. Quack!
Howdy there, Marty here, and we're back in this video with my review and discussion on Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. Let's just get right into it. It's a very, very long book, over 830 pages, 850 pages, give or take. So it's going to be a long video. It deserves to be a long video because not only is it a long book, but I enjoyed this book quite a bit. I guess that's already a little bit of a spoiler to the video, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things worth talking about, and that doesn't mean that there aren't negative qualities to the book, because I do think there's a lot of stuff here that is worth discussing. And depending on your mileage and your feelings and the way you interpret and have experienced the world, perhaps you'll feel differently about this book or whether or not you even want to read this book. So if you're just looking for me to give this book a completely amazing, glowing review, this might not actually be the video for you. And there are a lot of elements to this book that aren't really going to be for all readers, and all those things are worth discussing. So similar to how I did my Pet Sematary video, if you by any chance happen to watch that, we're first going to talk about some non-spoiler elements, the basic premise, probably some general pros and cons that aren't specifically too spoilery, and then we'll probably start to get more into spoiler territory. The very basic premise to this story is that it's a story about a group of men primarily made up of former Texas Rangers, cowboys, cowhands, outlaws, and misfits, and they decide to drive a herd of cattle basically across America from the south of Texas, really along the border of Texas and Mexico, all the way up to Montana, which at this point in time is still pretty unsettled and pretty wild. They hail from the town of Lonesome Dove. It's sort of a dusty, I don't know if you would say rundown town, but it's certainly a small, dusty town of little importance in Texas. It's also fictitious. There's a lot of reasons for why they would go on this trip. On the surface, it's really just because they want to essentially be the first cattlemen, or at least some of the characters want to essentially be the first cattlemen to really start settling Montana. There are a lot of other reasons for many of the different characters' motivations for why they would go on a trip like this, but obviously being the first major settlers to take over a whole area of the country. Montana is massive, of course. For those that don't know, I would think most people, at least Americans, would more or less know that Montana is quite big and vast. And yeah, it just poses a really good opportunity in terms of settling, the chance for adventure and prosperity. So that's on the surface why they are going on this trip. And that is true for some of the characters, but many of the characters have their own motivations for why they would make a quite perilous and dangerous journey still at this point in the country's history. Before we get too far into it, I want to cover some of the things to be aware of if you're thinking about starting this book, because in a way it would be unfair of me to make you watch half of this video before I started to discuss the things that might be an instant turnoff for you. So there are a lot of amazing things about this book. There are a ton of reasons to read this book. There are things that, depending on who you are and your sensitivity levels to certain things, you might struggle with this, or you might outright hate this book even. I want to just lightly cover some of those things now so you can just decide, hey, I'm not going to read this thing. So, first of all, the book is quite violent. For the most part, the violence isn't overly done. Much of the time, the violence is done sort of in between chapters or off screen, as it were. So you see the after effects of some pretty horrible violence. But in some cases, the violence does happen. Generally speaking, I will say it's probably done as a matter of fact rather than something that is like really explicitly described in the novel. It's not like reading Blood Meridian or, well, for me, I always think of Chuck Palahniuk books when I think of like things that are really gross or disturbing or gruesome. It's really not overly gruesome for the most part, but there is a lot of violence, and some of it is pretty rough, so that is a worthy consideration to maybe you wouldn't want to read this book. Now, granted, it's a Western, so for the most part, you should expect a certain degree of violence. But I just want to put that out there. Next, it is worth mentioning that there is sexual assault in this book. For the most part, similar to the level of violence. It's not generally super duper explicit, but it is there. And I don't think it should be downplayed because much of it is pretty rough. So that's another thing to consider. Continuing on, there is some rough language in this book. They even have the use of the N-word. So if that is a turnoff for you, if that's something that you wouldn't be able to handle in the context of reading a book about the West, the Wild West, post-Civil War, it's not overly used, to be honest, but it is in there. I didn't think it was going to be the kind of book that would use the term, but it does use it a few times throughout the course of the book. So, and they use other terms as well, like, for instance, people who work in the sex trade. They use the W word. So if that's a thing for you as well, perhaps you might not want to read this book. Now, I will say, obviously, those things are done for a sense of authenticity to the characters, to the time period, and the world in which they live, but it is worth noting. If those are things that are too hard for you to deal with, that's something to consider. And finally, the things that come to mind for me that are worth considering if you're going to tackle Lonesome Dove is it honestly doesn't have the friendliest representation of Native Americans. It also, of course, will depend on your sensibilities and maybe the things you are used to in media or the things that you're used to in Westerns. If you've seen a lot of Westerns, read a lot of Westerns, it's probably not going to stand out to you as something that was done poorly in this book. And I wouldn't even say that it was done poorly per se, but it's certainly not the friendliest representation of Native Americans, because in this book, they are generally viewed as a threat still. They're largely dehumanized, either being villains or sort of just off to the side. So I think for largely modern readers, it's not going to feel super progressive. I think even viewing it through the lens of something that was written 40 years ago, it probably could have done better or done differently if nothing else. Granted, that's entirely a taste issue. I think it's done with a certain respect to authenticity, to the characters, and to the story that he's telling, but it is worth noting. That could be a problem for a lot of potential readers, so that's why I'm going to say it here. Okay, still interested in reading the book? Fair enough. Let's move on. Yes, overall, I loved this book. It has stuck in my head for both some of its negative qualities and, in my estimation, its overwhelmingly positive qualities. This book, to me, almost reads like a Western Lord of the Rings. And what do I mean by that? Well, on the surface, it is an epic, certainly a Western epic, obviously taking place in the American West between the region of southern Texas and even Mexico, all the way up to Montana, rather than Tolkien's Middle-earth. But it is an epic, so in that respect, it feels like reading Lord of the Rings. It also features a massive cast of characters to keep track of. However, Lonesome Dove features significantly better characterization and dialogue, in my opinion. The story is about an incredibly long trek, also like Lord of the Rings, and the book is very much, in my estimation, more about that journey than ultimately the destination, wherever that may be. The book is also quite a slow burn, similar to that of Lord of the Rings in my opinion. I don't recall exactly when it takes place in Lord of the Rings and the Fellowship of the Ring, but if I recall, that book doesn't really, in my estimation, feel like it gets going until really the Rivendell scene, like the chase with them getting to Rivendell. That is sort of similar here, not necessarily in terms of action, but to really get into the meat of it, it feels probably like 100 to 200 pages before you really start to get to the meat of what this book is going to ultimately end up being. So it is a little bit of a slow burn. Similar to Lord of the Rings, there are still things that make the story completely worthwhile before you get to that moment. Like in Lord of the Rings, you have Bilbo's birthday. There's a lot of fun to be had in the book before you get to the action, to the journey. In Lonesome Dove, it's quite amusing in the early goings, and actually to that point, the book is actually really fun overall. It's not fun constantly. There are some really dark and some really heavy and unsettling moments in this story, but it's actually quite funny much of the time, especially in the early going. So slow burn, totally worth it though. But of course, we gotta talk about the characters. That is probably the overall strength of this book, is the characters are absolutely amazing. They're incredibly thoughtful, they're incredibly true to life and true to themselves, to the point of where sometimes it's even frustrating as a reader because they are so consistent and so true to themselves. And it's hard to argue with what the characters do ultimately, because they feel like they're very true to themselves. And I think that's an incredible strength of this book. And in that way, I almost relate this to something more like George Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. It's nothing like that series in most ways that I could think of in this exact moment, but in the way Martin dedicates time to all the various points of view and perspectives of his story, it's almost like that with Lonesome Dove. Difference being, A Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire is very much driven by third person limited, but point of view chapters, whereas Lonesome Dove is told with a third person omniscient set of narration, and all those points of view are completely woven together. So, you know, paragraph after paragraph, you have different like inner monologues or inner thoughts, different points of view kind of spliced together. So it's almost like if you took A Song of Ice and Fire and took a couple cleavers and just chopped up all the chapters and then just like shuffled them together. That's almost kind of like what it feels like with this book. It's incredibly well done. Like, I was never really confused by what characters were doing what, or who was thinking what, or who was in what place, or anything along those lines. And there are a lot of characters to keep track of in this book, and we're going to talk about some of them. But I could spend literally an hour doing a video just talking about the characters, like who they are and my feelings on them. We're not going to do that. All right, we're going to talk about the characters a little bit now. The main characters primarily as I view them, which are predominantly the men from the Hats Creek outfit who are driving the cattle herd from Lonesome Dove, Texas, all the way up to Montana. Okay, before we talk about the characters, I'm going to do a fun little thing here where I'm going to include pictures of who I imagined in the various roles. And this has nothing to do with the cast of the mini-series. So here is the cast as how I imagined them, regardless of how they're described in the book. Okay, first up, we're going to talk about Augustus McCrae, who, if I was forced to pick, is probably the main character of the book. Gus is a charming layabout. Like his partner, Woodrow Call, who we'll talk about in a moment, is a retired Texas Ranger. Gus is not a young man at this point in the story, but he has a youthful spirit about him, I would say. He's incredibly talkative. To Gus's credit, he is also incredibly reliable, and when the chips are down, you can really depend on him to get some serious stuff done. He's a more than capable fighter. He also has a surprisingly large amount of empathy. It's very easy to see why people walk away from this book saying that Gus is one of their favorite characters of all time, because to be honest with you, he's probably amongst my favorite characters of all time as well. Next up, Woodrow Call is also a former Texas Ranger. He was essentially the leader of their group, and when they all retired from ranging, he just kind of kept leading them. So he's sort of their de facto leader within this story. For the most part, he's a really quiet man. He's pretty unsociable, even with the people that he's spent 20 or 30 years with. He's got a very strong sense of duty and honor, probably to a fault, and he's an incredibly hard worker. He seems to be mostly driven by his desire, or perhaps need, to just continue working. Next up, we're going to talk about Lorena Woods. She also goes by Lori. When we start out the book, she's working as a prostitute in Lonesome Dove, working at a saloon called the Dry Bean. She originally hails from Alabama, and up until arriving in Lonesome Dove, she's had a tremendously difficult life. However, where the story picks up, for us, she's become a pretty strong person. Even with the men who partake in her services, she never really gives herself up fully emotionally. She never really allows those men to control the situation. It's worth noting that she is described as being an uncannily beautiful person, especially in the context of the world in which she lives. Next up, we have Jake Spoon, who's another of the former Texas Rangers. When we begin the novel, he's actually been away from Lonesome Dove for about 10 years. He's kind of your shiftless rogue gambler type, but he possesses a very odd amount of vanity. Talking about the rest of the Hats Creek outfit, there are a lot of other characters to keep track of. We're not going to talk about them right now or really in this video, but we're going to talk about the rest of the Hats Creek guys. Next up is Joshua Dietz, who entirely goes by Dietz throughout the course of this story. He's African American. He predominantly serves as the group's tracker and scout. He's wise and he's super in tune with the world around him, largely relating to nature. And he's described as being incredibly reliable. I believe he's even suggested to be Call's best man at one point or another in the story. There's P.I. Parker, who is a former lieutenant of the Texas Rangers under Augustus and Call. He's represented as being sort of a dumb guy, but really noble and trustworthy and pretty reliable. But he's not much of an independent thinker. He's pretty much someone that you gotta point in a direction, tell him to do a job, and he will do it. There's Bolivar, who's a former Mexican renegade and outlaw. He serves as the gang's cook at the beginning of the story, who splits his time largely between Lonesome Dove and his village just across the border with his family. And lastly, there's Newt Dobbs, who is the youngster of the outfit at 17. He is the son of a prostitute named Maggie who has passed away well in the past at this point in the story. He was pretty much raised by Augustus and Call. It needs to be said once again, the thing that McMurtry does absolutely amazingly in this story, and probably the main reason for reading this story, is his work with the characters. They're all incredibly well developed, and the interplay between the characters, the dialogue, it's absolutely amazing. It's funny, it's compelling, it's emotional. It's really a masterclass in how characters should be developed and handled, or at the very least in something that's like an epic that's going to give a whole lot of time to a lot of characters. That's really the core value in reading this story. Not to say that there aren't other things well done about it. I think he's painted a pretty cool world, or I should say he's painted a very real feeling world, and obviously the real world often sucks. He does a great job at painting a sucky world. He also does a pretty good job of painting a good world as well, and good people and horrible people as well. But if you're going to read Lonesome Dove, read it for the value you're going to take away from the characters, the characterization, and the dialogue. These are probably among the most real feeling characters I've ever had the joy of reading in a book. I do want to touch upon just a little bit about what apparently McMurtry's goal was with Lonesome Dove, which was demythologizing the West, the cowboy, the Western. Honestly, I didn't even know that was his goal when I started this book. I just started this book thinking, okay, cool Western adventure. It's long. I'm going to read it. Whatever, right? I love Westerns. And so that's why I read it. And I didn't really hear that that was his goal until after I finished the book. And now knowing that was his goal, looking back on it, could I see that? Could I see those points or maybe some of the things that he was trying to do? Yes. But to be honest with you, it didn't really strike me that way whilst reading it. And in all honesty, if that was his goal, he probably could have done a better job. And the reason why I say that is, yes, he makes them very flawed people. So if you're talking about sort of this representation of like the heroic cowboy figure, yeah, they are very flawed. But to be honest with you, even though they're flawed, for the most part, they're still all rather likable. All the main characters, at least, are all rather likable for the most part. Within the context of their world, are pretty cool. Gus is incredibly likable. Yeah, okay, he's flawed. He doesn't have this sort of impervious, like, heroic figure. You know, he's old and not that old, of course, but, you know, he's gotten older. He's not like this invincible cowboy John Wayne-esque kind of character. Same with Call, for that matter. But ultimately, they're all very capable when they're trying to be capable with anything that involves like action or violence or adventure. So I still think it kind of leans into sort of this heroic, or at the very least cool Western character. There are many things that make most of the other cowboys feel pretty cool and even at times heroic. So I don't know that McMurtry really succeeded if that was his goal. There are probably things that do it better, things that are better anti-Westerns. If this was supposed to be an anti-Western, I certainly didn't feel that way whilst reading it. If you're looking for the anti-Western, demythologizing the Western, something like Unforgiven is probably much more successful at that. Now, granted, Unforgiven came out several years after. That said, I liked this book significantly more than I like Unforgiven as a story. So, just in summary, if we're talking about that being one of his points, demythologizing the West or the cowboy, I can't say that he was overly successful. If he was going to do that, if that was the goal of the story, he probably could have leaned into it much harder, pretty easily, to be honest. Okay, I'm kind of realizing there's actually not a whole lot of spoiler discussion I want to get into, but we're going to start to get into spoiler territory here, so fair warning for the rest of the video, spoilers are going to be happening now. Okay, I've said enough how much overall I really enjoyed this book, and I want to give a couple examples of the things that I thought were incredible in this book. And it was interesting because towards the beginning of the book, I was starting to feel like, okay, this book's going to be pretty safe. And I started to feel that way especially around the time where they start adventuring into Mexico to steal the cattle that they're going to bring to Montana, right? You have like one really good sequence. It happens many times in the story before they get going, but there's really one big sequence that McMurtry shows you. It's mainly told from the perspective of Newt. And I was actually pretty worried for that scene initially because I was like, oh man, like Newt's gonna get it, right? Like Newt's gonna get hurt. He gets separated from the group. There's some shooting, cattle are everywhere, horses he can't really see, he's disoriented. I thought Newt was actually gonna be in trouble in this story, in this part of the story at least. And it didn't actually happen. Like he got back safely, and everybody got back safely. And then they proceed to venture into Mexico a number of times to steal a bunch of cattle, and at no point do they actually really enter any danger. Up to that point, I was like, oh man, this book's gonna be really safe. Like, that's gonna be like, is that gonna be boring? I'm gonna read this 800-page book in which everyone is safe. Like, that's a little bit of a struggle for me in this sort of setting. And it's not until they're leaving Lonesome Dove, they're just starting their journey, and, you know, one of the Irish characters gets killed, right? And he gets killed in a pretty horrible way, and it's almost like low-hanging fruit, right? I'm like, oh, okay, so you killed one of the two Irish characters. That essentially means the other Irish character is going to be completely safe, because there's no way you're going to kill both of them, right? And so that's how I felt about that. And I thought, okay, that's kind of easy to kill one of them. And I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. So you killed someone. Okay, so it's not totally safe, right? And then the story goes on. Eventually, you get... Okay, so this might end up looking really weird. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I got to keep filming, so I'm going to use my old A camera. Okay, jumping in here. Ultimately, it just... The subject got away from me a little bit. But one thing I thought this book did masterfully well was it totally mitigated those expectations of my thinking this world was going to end up being pretty darn safe. Because when horrible stuff starts happening, it's like pretty shocking. In particular, the execution of Jake Spoon really surprised me. I thought he could be in trouble because at that point we've now established that some of these characters aren't going to make it. But I honestly thought Jake would probably be taken out by one of the other outlaws. I honestly didn't think the gang would kill him. The book does an incredible job of how it gives you a real sense of danger for these characters. It just takes a little bit for it to get there. And then sort of the final stages of the story that didn't hit as well for me, but I'm battling with because I thought that McMurtry was very true to the characters, but in the end, you really want to see Call actually have the conversation with Newt, that Newt is his son. So I found that to be ultimately disappointed. Like, I get the gesture of the character. Call gives him the horse, which he's absolutely cherished. He literally says he cares more about the horse than his name because he doesn't give Newt his name, right? So he cares more about the horse, and he gives that to Newt. So that's very important. It's very symbolic. So, okay, fine. And he gives him his rifle. He gives him his pocket watch that was his father's, right? So it was his father's, and he's handing it down to Newt, which is very clearly his son. So he does everything but actually say it to Newt. And what makes it probably more hard than anything is the fact that we do have the internal monologue from Newt that Newt's actually very wounded by this. And it's hard because we were really rooting for that reveal in that relationship, and you don't really get it. So it does leave you kind of wanting. But I can make some peace with it because I also thought that was very Woodrow Call, you know, so it's tough. Once again, though, we circle back to the characters, the characterization, and the dialogue, the relationships between the characters. This book is amazing in that respect. It's a worthwhile experience just for that. I think he does some things in the story that are incredible and really hard to pull off. In all the ways the characters interact and come in and out of each other's lives is actually pretty incredibly well done. It's really hard to do when you have a cast of 20 or 30 or more named characters. They kind of run into each other again, or they run into each other in the first place, and they cross paths in a way. And most of the time in stories, that ends up feeling like overly coincidental or borderline impossible. And the way that it's done in Lonesome Dove is incredibly well handled. I never really once rolled my eyes like, oh, this is where July and Gus meet up again, or what have you, or various characters getting back together. So that was masterfully done as well. I think that's worth mentioning. It's really tough to tackle what the point of Lonesome Dove is as a story, right? I don't think there's a very super hard and fast, clear message or point that we're supposed to take away. I think very much, though, that this story is a portrait of people and people's importance to each other and how important independence and exploration and agency is. Of course, the agency is largely represented in Lori, right, who is trying to better her life by leaving Texas. She wants to get to San Francisco, ends up on the cattle train to Montana, right? But she's leaving to better herself. With Call and the gang, it's very much about the wilderness. They're part of this world that's aging and slipping away, and Montana represents this kind of last area they feel like they can reach and settle, and it could be theirs. And I think this book really shows how important relationships are to you. Relationships make or break who you are and your desires in a lot of cases. Surprisingly, it's represented in Woodrow Call, because after he loses Dietz, and especially after he loses Augustus, he pretty much loses all drive. Only P.I. and Newt are left over, right, from the Hats Creek outfit. Jake's even gone, right? And the book really illustrates how important these relationships are to oneself. So I think that's one of the points too. The book, it does a really good job of conveying how important human relationships are, even to characters who on the surface wouldn't seem to value those relationships.
Is it really that good? Yeah, it is really that good. Is it the great American novel? Perhaps not, but I'd still say it's a 5 out of 5 stars.
Okay, well, there's obviously a lot to unpack when it comes to Lonesome Dove, and this video is going to be an absolute monster for me to edit. I could keep talking, but I'm actually literally starting to lose my voice, so we're going to end the video here. I sure hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit that like button. If you'd like to see more videos from me, please hit that subscribe button. As I always say, it makes me feel like I accomplished something. But otherwise, I will see you in the next one. Bye.